reflecting on it all, and thinking about where we might go next, certainly here in Greater Manchester, and then hopefully may have implications for people in other places. Right from the beginning, we set an agenda, which we stayed with in the background. We go in other directions as we talk, of course, but basically we're looking at how can research and researchers contribute to the improvement of education systems. We could have done that anyway, but particularly during this terrible period of crisis that we've got. And what are the implications for working relationships between researchers and practitioners? So that's the general context for our discussion. But then specifically what we've done is we've used the work that's going on in Greater Manchester in response to the pandemic as an example, in order that we can reflect on what we've learnt regarding these two questions. So just very briefly, for colleagues who are not from our area, Greater Manchester is not just the city of Manchester, it's 10 separate local education or separate councils really, each with their own education service. The population of Greater Manchester is about 2.8 million, and there are about 1,300 schools across the city region. Just to say, for those of you who maybe are coming from outside of England, and of course our policy has led to a very complex arrangement of schools, because we've got schools with different kinds of governance arrangements. They're mostly state schools, but they have different governance arrangements and different funding arrangements. So when we're talking about collaboration, as we're going to talk about for the next hour or so, we're talking about collaboration in a context which in some sense is not exactly designed to make it work. So that's the Greater Manchester context. And what we're talking about is a strategy to support schools across those 10 local authorities. Now, myself and other colleagues over the last 20 years or so have been involved in a series of initiatives which have led to the kind of thinking that we are going to explore today. And I just want to briefly tell you the story of that, some steps on the journey, if you will. There are other things we could have talked about. When I say we in all of this, I'm talking about the fact that quite a lot of my colleagues were involved in these various initiatives. I was probably the common person all the way through, and some of the colleagues involved are now retired and playing golf and out on their boats and things. The starting point was a project called Excellence in Cities. We were commissioned by the then Department for Education and whatever it was called at that point to support a particular initiative around the concept of leadership. And there's quite a lot of money, not to us, but to the schools. And briefly, what the project involved was schools formed small groups, 4, 5, maybe schools, secondary schools only, by the way. And these were all schools serving highly disadvantaged communities. And they were encouraged to form collaboratives. They were called collaboratives, in fact, and money was allocated to the collaborative, provided they agreed a common plan as to how they were going to address what we now call the challenge of equity. So that was the beginning of us thinking about the potential of schools supporting one another and working together. That was a 3-year initiative. One of my colleagues in the other university, MMU, followed this in the period after the 2006, and actually found that the impact was much greater later. And I think there's a lesson in there for governments that they sometimes give up on projects because that was the last minister's project, or maybe the money's run out, or maybe it didn't work. And then you find later there has been an impact. So we learned quite a bit from that about the potential of schools supporting each other, particularly in relation to vulnerable groups of learners. Then the big one, in a sense, was the Greater Manchester Challenge, which occurred between 2008 and 2011. This followed on from the London Challenge, which has been much reported in the literature. And it was a 3-year initiative. We took ideas from London, but we redesigned them in relation to the context of Greater Manchester. And of course, that reminds me to say, in all of this, context matters. And you can learn from something from somewhere else, but you can't necessarily implement it in a straightforward way. You have to take account of the contextual factors. Briefly, the Greater Manchester Challenge involved all the schools across the city region. I fell on my feet in a way that I couldn't believe, because I was asked by government to be what was called the chief advisor. and I had a fair degree of influence, not control, including over £50 million, which was quite handy when you were trying to encourage forms of collaboration. And what we did within that project was that we encouraged schools to work together, again, across the borders of the different local authorities. And that theme of crossing borders is fairly important to what we're going to talk about in relation to our current work. We had all schools in Greater Manchester in what were called families of schools. These families were made up of schools serving similar communities. There were 58 primary families and there were 11 secondary families. We also integrated the special provision into those. And the money was made available to them to free up time in order that they could work together. And there is an evaluation, and it had a very significant impact in Greater Manchester and in London. And there is an evaluation which is on the chat if you want to read up about that project. After that, of course, we had a new government around about that period, 2002. And so there wasn't so much money coming to the sort of things we were talking about because the new government had a rather different approach. So within the university, a group of us set up another project organized from the university where we invited schools. They were schools that were doing very well, at that time designated as teaching schools, and we joined them together in a network that we called the University of Manchester Coalition of Research Schools. And a group of us worked with those schools, helping them to think about how they could use forms of inquiry, action research, if you will, within their schools to think about how they could improve what they were doing, again, particularly regards vulnerable groups of children. But we also had in mind that those schools could become hubs for other schools. Now, this project had a mixed impact, I have to say, and there are all sorts of reasons for that. But one of them was we were doing this in a period when the policy wasn't particularly supportive to this kind of thing. We were in a very centralized period, and local action was not one of the things that was being particularly encouraged. But nevertheless, there was some very good work going on. Sally, who's one of the head teachers on the panel in a few minutes, her school was involved and did some very interesting work during that period. And then around about 2017, a group of us set up another project on similar lines, which we called Reaching Out to All Learners. It was instigated from within Greater Manchester. There was a small amount of money made available to support the schools. The schools were formed into trios. So you get the sense that there were lessons being drawn as we went along this journey. And what we were trying in this period, 2017 to 2019, was to test that out. Now, of course, we had no idea that the pandemic was coming on, but when I talk to you in a minute about the pandemic, you'll realize that the origins of its design are in all of these projects, but particularly that Reaching Out to All Learners. It was 18 secondary schools in 6 trios, and my colleagues Paul and Steve did quite a bit of formal research to observe what was going on, and we drew a lot of lessons from all of that. So there are patterns in all of this, which I'm trying to sort of signal because they're relevant to the story of Pathways to Success, our current project. One of the patterns is to do with the role of people from the university. In each of these initiatives, there were colleagues from the University of Manchester working in the projects, taking ideas from research, evidence from formal research to be fed into this discussion. That was part of it. But then doing something else, which I believe was possibly more significant, in that because they were partners in the projects, working with head teachers, working with local authority colleagues, sometimes working with colleagues from the government, because we were partners in it, we were able to be at the table when decisions were being made. And I think part of what we took into that context was a way of thinking about change, a way of thinking about change based on the use of evidence, a way of thinking about change which includes critical questioning and challenging. And what was developing, I think, was what I'd call a reflective stance, an inquiry stance, if you want, an inquiring stance, where we were modeling as well as encouraging people to ask questions about what we were learning from these initiatives. So it put the kind of researcher in a slightly ambiguous position at times, and the skills of learning how to do all of that, I think, was part of what we learned over those 20 years. So what we can say from all of those initiatives in summary, and there are some references on the chat if you want to read some of this stuff up. We came to the conclusion quite early on that what we had already witnessed through these various initiatives was the massive untapped potential that was there within the education system. And so if you believe that, as I clearly do, much of what you would try to do in order to take the system forward is to draw on that potential, draw on the expertise, the creativity, the enthusiasm that's there in the classrooms, in the schools, in the local communities. So that's one of the fundamental questions, outcomes, if you will. We then, this phrase I used before, inquiring stance, we saw how the development of an inquiring stance in schools, in networks of schools, could actually stimulate new thinking, challenging existing assumptions, and sometimes leading to the development of new ways of working, always focusing on those youngsters whose progress we are concerned. Network, therefore, became a way of sharing that knowledge, sharing that expertise, and critically to what we're going to talk about, cross-border networking seemed to be potentially very powerful. In other words, learning from differences, talking to people who you don't normally talk about, being asked questions which perhaps you don't normally have to answer, seemed to be quite powerful, and that's what we've worked on in the current project. Crucial to it as well is the leadership for it mostly came from within schools. And in all of those initiatives we talked about, coming from the university, we palled up with groups of senior staff in schools who took on that leadership role. And I think, you know, that's part of a national trend that's been going on for some time. But I think it's very important to everything we're going to talk about. But then all of this needs some kind of coordination. And that's a bit of a question mark in the English context at the moment, because it's not terribly clear who is responsible at the local level. Traditionally, it was the local authority going back many years, but successive governments have rather kind of taken the power and indeed the resources from local authorities, and they've had to develop new ways of working. But in all those projects I've talked about, colleagues from the local authorities were partners, bringing their bigger picture of what was going on in their local areas. And then there has to be some kind of political mandate. If this kind of work is going to have clout, the people who are leading on it, particularly the people in schools, people like myself coming from the university, we've got to believe that we're standing up for some kind of authority. Now, where that comes from is increasingly difficult in the English context because of the complex nature of policy making. Sometimes it was very much about government, the Greater Manchester Challenge. We had the authority of the government. We had a minister working with us, a named minister, as they'd had in London. And of course, we had a lot of government dosh, which was quite handy in terms of making things happen. In the work we're doing at the moment, the mandate really comes from the combined authority. That is the political combined authority of Greater Manchester with our own mayor, Andy Burnham. It comes from that partnership. So we move on then with all that thinking in our minds. And I should say that list of things that we've just seen there in summary, in a way are the design features for what I'm going to talk about. From all those previous experiences and reading a wider research, what we're saying is we're designing a strategy to see if it will work, and it's based on those ideas. So the strategy is called Pathways to Success, for which I'll explain in a moment. It's trying to engage everybody in Greater Manchester, the schools, other partners, families, everybody who might have a say. And of course, what we know about educational change is it's quite difficult to achieve. So you need some kind of mantras, you need some kind of flags where people can say, I see what it's about. Now, the mantra that we've chosen is what we call the 3 Ps. What we're trying to do is improve the presence of all children and young people, their participation within schools, and their progress. Now, those concepts are defined very generally, and of course, they will be redefined in the field as people start getting involved in the initiative. The key features of the strategy that we've developed is that it emphasizes the importance of evidence, varied kinds of evidence. Of course, statistics is a starting point, but also evidence gained through intelligence that's there in the system, through debate, through observation, particularly trying to identify effective practice that can be moved around. As has been the pattern in the other projects, it's led by people in schools. It's collaborative, building on the evidence that we have that partnerships can work. And it's coordinated by a local strategy group one or two of you are going to meet in a moment or two, head teachers, local authority colleagues, and university people involved as well. So there's the partnership of the different kind of expertise. At the heart of it is the creation then of these groupings to move knowledge around. We call them action learning trios. We're creating trios of schools where we hope the schools will be active in learning from each other. Based on the evidence we have from before, they are schools that serve similar communities, but are from 3 different local authorities in each case. And of course, in the new complex arena, that means not just crossing the border of local authorities. Often we're crossing the borders between multi-academy trusts, between maintained schools and faith schools, and so on. There are all sorts of subtle borders in the English system. But the theory that we're exploring is that differences, different ways of working, different ways of talking, different ways of thinking, can encourage stimulate creativity and innovation. Over the last 12 months, we've had 2 phases of activity. I've not got the exact figure, but it's towards 150 schools so far have participated. We tried to keep it light-handed for obvious reasons, knowing the pressure that everybody is under. And we've invited schools to have at least one online meeting with senior people to talk about the agenda that we've raised and to share ideas and to move knowledge between them in order to decide what else can be done. From what we've seen so far, we've got quite a lot of promising evidence. Now, this evidence comes from the reports that the trios have made, and there are 2 reports, and I'll give you the link for that at the end of the meeting. And those 2 reports, quite extensive, explaining the kinds of discussions they had, and particularly the kinds of ideas that they moved around. I mean, it underlines the first point, the immense expertise that's there in the school system that we've got to make use of, and indeed the creativity. I mean, what is quite striking from those reports is how schools have developed a new kind of flexibility around timing, around organization, about the way they work with families and the wider community. And there are positives in this that we can build on. It confirms, from my point of view, I believe, that creating pathways, now you understand why we call them pathways to success, opportunities, links that people can talk to one another is a helpful thing to making this happen. And the action learning trios, as far as we can see, have made it happen to varying degrees. And where we're going here, and that's why the timing of this discussion this afternoon is so crucial. We had another meeting yesterday to talk about this. We're planning about what will be in the 3rd phase, which I hope will start in September. The only other part of the story that you need to know is that my 2 colleagues who are in this meeting, Steve and Paul, have been carrying out an independent evaluation of this. So here's another role for researchers, not being so much hands-on and partners, but actually looking at it slightly from the outside. And they've carried on a series of focus group interviews, and maybe at some point in this discussion, we'll give a flavour of what they have done. And they will also shortly produce a report, which will add to the list of reports we've already got. So that's the story so far. What have I done? Right. So the discussion can go where we want it to go, but as a suggestion to start getting us going, what are the lessons from these experiences? What are the barriers that we've seen and how can these be addressed? And thinking about next year, what are the implications for future policies and practice? Now, our panel in alphabetical order is made up of these colleagues. We've got Phil Bessick, who was previously the Director of Education in Stockport and now works very actively in a number of other local authorities in Greater Manchester and is part of the group that is coordinating Pathways to Success. We've got Joseph Flesser, Joe from the University of Toronto, and it's going to be great to hear his external perspective on our work. Joe is involved in similar work in Toronto, in the city of Toronto, in a very different context, different policy context, and we look forward to hearing his ideas. We've got Ruth Lupton, who is Honorary Professor at the University of Manchester. Ruth has an eminent history of doing research on system place-based change. She's been a partner in all of this, semi-detached partner, if you will. So she had a sort of an internal view, but I think an external view, and I look forward to hearing her thoughts on all that. We've got Sally McFarlane, who is the head teacher of Ladyword School, and they also have a multi-academy trust in Bolton. Sally has been very closely involved in the early projects and has been one of the group of head teachers who've been helping to design pathways to success. And then last but by no least, Pat Murden, who was until recently the head teacher of St. Pat's High School in Salford, and now he's doing missionary work in London because he's now executive of a multi-academy trust in the Diocese of Westminster. So very different views. So I think the best way to start it off, but I want the discussion to flow in whichever way we want to go. Remember, we're keeping an eye on the chat as well, and put your hand up if you want to chip in. We'll go alphabetically through those names if we might, and just thinking aloud from each of you now about those three questions. Take it where you want to take it, looked at from your perspective. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Mel. You've actually captured, Mel, quite a lot of what one might say in terms of what we know about the organisation of the partnerships. But I thought I'd just pick up on what I've read, because I was part of the writing in terms of the reports on the partnerships and the trios work. Mel very cleverly chose the 3 Ps. That was, for me, there's some learning there. That flagged to schools where their conversation can be branded, if you like, and it helped them think in those terms. It also helped a number of them plan together in terms of their school improvement planning under presence, the attendance, exclusion, inclusion of youngsters, participation, a very broad view of participation. Very interestingly, very few schools actually came in to that conversation looking at what one might call the more formal curriculum. Many started actually looking at the informal curriculum, at the pastoral curriculum, to ensure that youngsters were content and had behaviours ready to learn, particularly when they returned to school. And progress, there's perhaps been less conversation around progress because much of what schools have been doing at the moment is looking at those first 2 in preparation for improving the outcomes. So I feel as though that's very key. I think the other thing that we learned was in the second round of when we organised the trios, we put forward a series of prompts. We weren't sure about that. You know, do you put a series of prompts to professionals to help them form their conversations around the 3 Ps? However, we did do that. The feedback was very much that was extremely helpful. They felt that the prompts, they were broad, they allowed conversation, but they were helpful in folk developing professional conversations and looking actually to solve some of the challenges that were there. I think the third thing that came through, what we learned is it's a pretty lonely job being a head teacher. And it's very important to have another colleague who may be echoing some of the concerns and challenges that you have. And what came through, I won't say surprisingly, because I might have understood that that was the case, having worked with head teachers previously, but at that time of crisis, that working not just within your local authority and with extremely good support from the local authorities in Greater Manchester and from the MATs, having the perspective of someone outside of your local context and them echoing some of the concerns you had seemed to be very powerful to colleagues. It seemed to reassure them that they weren't alone in the issues that they were dealing with. So I think that those aspects of construct and what we know about the importance of those conversations came through very strongly. And I'm aware of time, Mel, so you know I can
carry on, Joe.
It seemed to me then at the end that there was, Mel talks about the 3 Ps, so I was sort of playing with the 3 Cs here, or a number of Cs, because one of the things that we had here was obviously a common language, the 3 Ps. We had a coordination that myself and Margaret Woodhouse, who isn't here tonight, organised. We looked at the data across GM and we matched schools based on broadly on free school meals outside of their local authority. That was powerful. We also then captured the information that came back through a formalized sense. So another C there. We then circulated the information and the challenges and the changes that people had taken place. So there, with a number of C's there, but it helped me think through today what I might say. I think those are really important aspects. A common language, a clarity in terms of the prompts, an ability to have a conversation outside of the schema that you've got, and a sense that this is research, that you are collecting information that is valuable to others. It gave the profession, as it should do, a sense that they are important beyond their own school and to a broader group. We've work to do, and I know we'll come on to the other questions later, Mel, in terms of where next. But one of the things I would say for policy is collaboration between schools needs to be it needs to be organized. It needs to be seen as a key driver for school improvement, and it needs to have a common language. We had a meeting yesterday with GM, and we were talking about the common language and the importance perhaps of the 3 Ps. I have worked in a number of local authorities who are actually taking those 3 Ps as their way of looking at a COVID recovery strategy. So it helps if we can get the common language right. So in terms of policy, there's something there for me about ensuring that that mantra is seen as a way of hanging your hat on how you might move the process forward with more schools. Communication's another issue. How do we get out to those schools? Time's an issue for schools at the moment, and also the funding. But I'd just say on the funding, finally, we did not fund this group of trios. They met themselves without any funding. They met virtually. They engaged in some cases on more than one occasion, and virtually every trio has said they will be carrying this relationship forward because they found it so beneficial. I'll stop there, Mel.
Well, thank you. There's a lot in that, Phil. Just to say that there's a bit of history and a bit of theory in the 3 Ps. When we did the Greater Manchester Challenge, we had 3 As, and I was sitting here while you were talking, trying to remember what they were. One of them was access, I know, but the bit of theory, of course, which most people are familiar with, it takes us back to Joe's colleague in Canada, Michael Fullan, who's the great guru on educational change. And his most significant book, I think, was called The Meaning of Educational Change. And it was quite a depressing book. It's had a series of editions. It's quite depressing, really, because Michael came to the conclusion that most efforts to change education systems, even if they go off to a good start, fail. And part of his explanation was that it's about social processes of learning. And if people don't have a common understanding of what the change is about, then it probably will get left at the classroom door. Not least because teachers haven't got a lot of time to have a listen to what somebody else is suggesting for somewhere else. So the argument is, if you can give a kind of simple mantra, maybe doesn't give meaning, but at least gets attention where meaning might be socially constructed in particular places. So all of this is illustrating how over those 20 years, little ideas like that from formal research have been fed in, and we see the benefits of it. Okay, so let's go to Canada. Joe, you're looking at this from a very different perspective, and I can't wait to hear what you've noted, what struck you in all of this. So over to you, Joe.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to be here. It's I've been thinking about the language that you've used in this session and in other sessions around having an inquiry stance. And I'm thinking about how stimulating it is for me as an outsider to be thinking about and learning about the work that you're doing. So thanks for the invitation. I've got 4 kind of comments to give. You know, I'm coming at this as an academic. I was formerly a school teacher and a school principal. So I have that in my background as well. But I think my role here is to kind of frame a series of questions around what I've been listening to and hearing. And the first thing that I find so encouraging about the work that's being done is, I think we live in a moment where, I mean, maybe this is always the case in education, where there's this search for this one technical solution to an educational problem. If we can just find that one thing, it'll solve all problems. And what I appreciate about the story that's coming out of Greater Manchester is there isn't that embrace of a single simple solution. In fact, there's this articulation that any problems that are seen in the educational realm have been historically, collectively, over years, for many reasons, created. And so many years of effort from many people are required to make a difference. So I appreciate that it's not a kind of, let's find that one thing, but it's actually, hey, these were created over time, these problems were created over time. We're going to work on them over time to try to make them better. So that's one thing that I observe. One of the things I keep thinking about, well, I think about this with any educational change initiative, and I'm thinking about this at the Manchester experience, is why does anybody ever do the difficult thing? I mean, I don't say that cynically, but like there's a question here about what's the incentive for folks, I'm not an economist, but what's the incentive for folks to do this work at all? Why does the status quo continue to exist in most systems? Because it's easier. So that's not the story coming out of these experiences in Manchester. So I think it's worth trying to think through, you know, why, how did it happen that folks are trying to take on this challenging work? And I think that multiple ways, like if you notice the slides that started today's presentation, they're historical. They go back sort of to show a kind of policy archaeology. Like there's several layers that explain where this moment came from. I think that's important. There's a kind of political science angle that, you know, some American scholars would notice that there's a kind of civic capacity being engaged here. There's multiple folks who are investing in an educational realm, and they're not all from the education sector. So I think that's important. So like, how do you create the conditions or the preconditions to get people to work together so that they do the difficult thing? That's a question I'm asking myself to think as I think about Ontario and I think about Toronto. The next question that I have for myself, and this is more of an open question, and I don't know the answer to this. I myself have used in some of my own writing this idea that an inquiry stance is a kind of rebuttal to typical, at least in urban education, typical framings that of deficit, like that where you sort of imagine that the problem exists in the home, the problem exists in the neighborhood, the problem exists, you know, outside my span of control in the school. And actually being more curious about where educational challenges are coming from is a kind of remedy to deficit framings. But the more I thought about that over the years, that's not necessarily the case. So how do you keep, like, I guess a question that I've got, maybe this is an implication, maybe it's a potential barrier. How do you make sure in these trios or in the work that's being done that the inquiry stance isn't a question where the central question isn't, what is wrong with this community? Like that would be a terrible inquiry stance to take. Yeah. So I'm interested in how does the inquiry stance end up being, you know, more oriented towards the work that can be done in a positive way with communities from educators. So I'm curious about that because when we're talking about, you know, education in cities, we're talking about inequality, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about power differentials. How do you sort of engage an inquiry that actually acknowledges those as being sort of underlying the work that you're doing without locating the problem or the responsibility for the challenge outside the realm of what educators can do? So that's something that I have a question about. And then the final, no, I got two more. So the third question I wanted to say was, I'm really interested in this one, the notion of innovation. So these are stories from these trios and from work over time of innovation. And I think a lot of the story of innovation, or at least a lot of the rhetoric around innovation, is that you need autonomy to be able to innovate. That's a kind of neoliberal framing that, like, market-based, you know, remedies are going to get people working on their own individual thing, but they need the autonomy to do that. What's interesting about this experience is it's not really autonomy that gets people innovating, it's collaboration. So I'm trying to think about whether or not autonomy and collaboration are in tension with each other, or whether or not they are like how they connect, how they're related to each other. And then the final thing that I observe, and this might be a barrier or an implication. So I was interested in the conversation about local authorities. Here in Ontario, we'd use the language of the district to talk about how important districts are in supporting or, frankly, obstructing attempts to collaborate or make change in schools. And what's strange, looking at this purely as an academic, what's interesting to me is the amount of research produced about districts has grown. there's a growing, ever-growing amount of interest in districts. But the power that districts have over the years has shrunk. I don't know how to make sense of academics' interest in a realm that has less and less influence as initiatives get, at least in Ontario, get re-centralized to a ministry perspective. So as I was thinking about the way that folks on this presentation were talking about local authorities and how that's changed so radically over the span of the projects in Manchester, I'm trying to think about if their ability to influence is shrinking, should we keep studying them? What's left to be learned? Anyway, those are some inputs there.
They're very helpful questions, Joe. I mean, on that last issue, to say, I think what I'm hearing from head teacher colleagues is that in this last phase, the last 18 months, whatever it is, we've seen a strengthening of relationships between schools and local authority colleagues. In a sense, I think, in a kind of ad hoc way, in England, local authorities are gradually redesigning themselves to fit the new context. And somehow or another, a small positive thing that's come out of the pandemic is it's strengthened relationships to carry out that exploration. And it's something I think we have to work through, because there has to be some coordination. And at the moment, we're very fragile in that. So that's very helpful. Thank you. Okay, Ruth, I described you as an insider and an outsider. Where do you want to talk from?
I'm going to do both.
Okay.
So I'm coming partly from a university researcher perspective, but partly from someone who's been involved in a lot of conversations about the directions of social policy and devolution in Greater Manchester. So I'm going to reflect on a bit of both. So I've drawn three perhaps rather obvious lessons from this programme. The first is that teachers are producers of knowledge, not just consumers of and implementers of research. Reading the report, it's a mind-boggling body of knowledge that has been produced in really quite a small programme. But this isn't reflected in current policy thinking about research-informed practice, which has a much more unidirectional model. But at the same time, it seems that the partnership with the universities enables access to academic research knowledge and also situates these specific teacher inquiries within broader context. But there's currently no real incentive or funding for university colleagues to engage in this kind of work at the moment. So that's the first one. The second one, and this relates to the conversation just now between Joe and Mel, it seemed to me that GM, Greater Manchester as a scale, made sense to the participants here. They're happy and indeed keen to collaborate across local authority boundaries, and that seems to me quite important, because there's locally there's a sort of political reluctance, I think, to intervene in schools at the Greater Manchester level because there are no powers, and there's certainly reluctance from the Department for Education to give any push to intervention at the Greater Manchester level. But it seems to be, because of the policy archaeology, it seems to be a scale that works for school-to-school collaboration. And the third lesson, connecting to what Phil said, was the challenges that the schools were dealing with in terms of educational recovery were really, really deep and complex. I mean, the programme really made visible the depth of poverty and inequality, and it's interesting that the schools went, first to pastoral and family and community issues. And it also made visible, I think, the extra work that teachers and school leaders are having to do in areas of deep disadvantage. I think this message really needs to come loud and clear from the programme, and that schools can't take sole responsibility for education recovery, and that education recovery needs to be positioned in any case more broadly than catching up with lost examination learning. So those are my three lessons, and then my next steps sort of relate to those. So firstly, on the school-university partnerships, I think we need three things there. The first is a national policy focus on enabling professional inquiry by teachers and school leaders. And I think we could look usefully to the example of Wales. I don't want to give too much away about this because I think it's not yet in the public domain, but they're launching a new strategy around this in the next couple of weeks. Secondly, I think we need to think of ways to change the funding structure and incentives for higher education researchers to engage in this kind of work. And I can talk a bit more about my specific ideas on this if we get there. But also I think we could start to try and make more use of the emerging civic university agreements, of which one is currently in development by the 5 universities of Greater Manchester, to build more capacity for research on education. And this links to what Joe was saying about how we build civic capacity. And on the second point, which is about local coordination, really, I think we do need to hook into broader citywide strategies to develop this work. It just always seems a complete nonsense to me that while almost every other aspect of people's lives in Greater Manchester is now subject to some kind of Greater Manchester-wide strategy, schooling is not. And one implication of that is it's really difficult to join up working in schools with wider work on poverty and inequality in a coherent way. It can be done by individual organisations. And I was recently a member of the Greater Manchester Independent Inequalities Commission, and we recommended there that as part of broader strategies for addressing inequalities, there should be a new education challenge in Greater Manchester, which should be based around a new set of shared well-being goals for children and young people. And that it should include, among other things, resources to support more of this work, supplemented with a team of expert advisors a la Greater Manchester Challenge, and a focus on the schools that may need the support most but may find it most difficult to take part. So while that isn't, of course, about school-university partnerships, it perhaps gives a wider context in which the university and practitioner partnerships might develop in this city region. And I'd be quite interested to discuss here a little bit what people think of that proposal and where it might lead in terms of the conversation today.
Thank you, Ruth. Okay, let's have some insider perspectives there. And first of all, with Sally, who's been very closely involved in the Pathway strategy. Sally.
Hello there, hi. I suppose I just want to make a couple of points really. I'm the head teacher of a special school, and we have a multi-academy trust which also includes another special school and a post-19 provision for young people with additional needs. So inevitably my perspective is going to be skewed towards those perhaps the smaller population that exists within the special school sector across the education system as a whole. However, I do think that the issues and the challenges that we've all been through over the last 18 months are system-wide. And I also think our experience of participation and collaboration has also been system-wide. So although I have a specific context, I hope that the couple of points I wanted to make really relate across the whole system. And I was really interested in something that Joe mentioned earlier, where he was talking about have we innovated because of collaboration? And that really made me think about something that I've been pondering on, which is around we have been innovative, we've had to be innovative, and actually we've had to collaborate. And both of those things have come out of a crisis. And because we've been in a time of crisis, we've had to turn to our partners, those who we collaborate with, for mutual support. But in doing that, we've also been able, possibly at times without the intention, to innovate. And it has really challenged our thinking about the way we do things and what the outcomes will be long term of this collaboration. I think is very much yet to be seen. So I do think that that's a really powerful part of this project, that it's enhanced the partnerships that we've already got, and it's also enhanced the ability for us to use collaboration as a vehicle for greater innovation. I think one of the biggest things that as a school leader we've found, and although I'm speaking from one sector, I do believe that this is the case across the board, is that we have all been dealing with issues that we have no blueprint for. We were having things thrown at us on a daily basis. We were literally waiting for the next bit of guidance coming through on email. We were having to respond to things that none of us had any experience of previously. And actually the power of collaboration in that situation was phenomenal, really. And I think even the most experienced of school leaders had to turn to those around them and to share practice, to share experience, and sometimes, being perfectly honest, sharing panic of what do we do next? Yeah. Taking on board other people's ideas in a way in which we've never had to do before. And I think that that's been a really interesting journey that we've been on. And Pathways to Success has given a structure around that, where schools have been able to come together as groups of 3 and share that partnership. But actually, I think we've seen that approach mirrored across the whole system. And one of the things I feel as an educationalist is I really hope we don't lose that, because it would be very easy in a few months' time to kind of go back to normal. But I think we've opened up as a result of that need to collaborate. I think linked to that, one of the other things I wanted to say was that I feel the concept of a school at the heart of a community is probably the one thing that has been the most powerful for children, for families, for communities in the broadest sense. And it's made me reflect on the fact that I think we've lost a lot of the power of a school being at the heart of a community. And again, this current scenario that we've dealt with has brought us all back to focus on the things that being at the heart of a community means. And so the numbers of food banks that we were operating, that we saw operating across the system, the number of families who were turning to schools for support and advice in ways in which we've never really experienced. I mean, schools have always been a hub for families and parents and the community, but in a way that at times we've never had that level of demand around us being really key to the community within which we exist. And we could all talk about endless, I'm sure any school leader will be able to talk about the endless experiences they had that perhaps they'd not encountered before, and that was about those community relationships and dealing with the challenges of the things that our children and families were dealing with on a daily basis. And then finally from me, and that this is just perhaps something that I think is perhaps a little bit more specific to the sector within which I work, which is for those children and young people with additional needs, is I think COVID has actually really challenged our thinking about learning and about how children learn, and about how we at times have a tendency to put children into boxes in terms of what our expectations are. And in a very bizarre kind of way, I do think that having gone through the last few months, the last year, 18 months, however long it is, we've all lost track, haven't we, of the experience that we've had, I certainly feel that in our schools, it's really challenged our thinking about learning and about children and young people's resilience and how great that resilience is, but also about how we should shift some of our expectations and some of the things that we all worried about incredibly prior to the pandemic. Actually, they're not really the issue that we thought they were. And some of our children and young people have absolutely stunned us through this process. And we need not to lose that. We need to capture that, and we need to take it forward in some way. And I don't have the answers to how we do that, but I just feel that in all of this crisis, and I know I've used that word several times, actually there's been massive learning, and massive gains in some ways in terms of collaboration and in that aspect of thinking around children's learning. So that's it from me. That's just kind of an insider perspective, really, of how from a school point of view, it's been at times, frankly, really awful, but also at times actually really, really thought-provoking as well, and refreshing at times, because we've had to move on in a different way.
Thank you, Sally. Okay, Pat, another insider view on all of this from the secondary perspective.
Yeah, with the graveyard shift, Mel, I was worried about what I was going to say, and what many of the pertinent points have been touched upon by prior speakers. So I'm just going to pick up on a couple of the threads, really. First of all, Ruth, where you finished on the centrality of education in the devolution agenda, I think is absolutely critical, and just echoed there by Sally in terms of schools at the heart of the community. It strikes me that the unifying, if you like, public space for families in a time of crisis is schools. You know, all the other social bodies touch upon family lives at different points, but schools for me are the most democratizing of them, and the one that happens most. So just to echo points from prior colleagues. In terms of the broader agenda themes of how can research contribute to the education system, I think the linking of researchers and universities to leaders and teachers in real time, and I know this has been a time of crisis, as Sally's just articulated, is critical, and that idea of collaborating in real time, not years after a kind of research piece and so on, has been very powerful, I think, throughout this process. And in terms of implications for future practice, as a practitioner and school leader, I think the educationalists, if we're taking a broad realm, the researchers such as Mel, providing a macro stimulus, so that framed discourse, that broad headings, and as Phil touched upon, you know, the language to stimulate collaboration has been critical, and then allowing for the micro actions of practitioners to get on with making sense of them and using them in real time, and then almost curating and amplifying the impacts back. I think there's a power in that kind of feedback loop, I think was a phrase Phil used earlier. And then just in kind of three broad themes of my own reflections, I too had added crisis to that idea of the power of collaboration. I think you can sense from school leaders that we see collaboration as inherently good, and we're naturally drawn to it. It's something that all the best teachers and school leaders do instinctively. I think I was worried when we tried to launch this that we wouldn't find the time and space. Again, it shows that I think when there's a powerful rationale, and it's clearly, you know, the 3 Ps allowed us to hook fellow school leaders with that, and to give a rationale for partaking, and that's been very powerful. I've mentioned already, I think those kind of macro prompts were critical in guiding and stimulating discussions, but then allowing the space for schools to work within. And that in turn has led to innovation. And Joe made a point around how do we create the kind of conditions to do things differently. Obviously, crisis is very powerful, but I think framing themes, I think the power that the researchers can bring to it is key themes that matter, that can have a kind of macro impact, a big impact, and allowing practitioners to make sense of them and actually affect the lives of children and practice in real time. So summarising from me, I think the project has been a kind of macro actor that's created the themes, the space, and curated the process that's allowed the practitioners to get on with the micro impacts. And I don't think we've yet, you know, we've not got to the end of this process, so we're yet to fully realise its potential. But I've certainly valued it. And just one final thing, I think Joe touched upon, policymakers and interventions in school, that idea that we see the need, there's almost a catastrophizing and a need to intervene in education. There's always something wrong in education that we need to fix. There's an awful lot that's right in education, and it's about improvement. And I think in terms of that wider role for educational leadership, I wrote down the phrase guided navigation rather than intervention. It's almost the job of the Mels of the world and the researchers to help us steer and stick to the macro. As Sally said, there's not a lot of space for us at the moment or you would imagine there isn't, in terms of the operational reactiveness of crisis. And yet we all absolutely appreciate the need for moving forward. We are relentless, restless kind of innovators by nature. And so that kind of role of guided navigation, I think, is critical for us moving forward. So a wide-ranging ramble, Mel, but I hope it.
Not at all, no. Well, I mean, thank you to all of you. I mean, there's so much food for thought. I mean, the fact that we've got this on video now to be used to share with other people is going to be a great gift. There's been lots going on the chat, and I've been trying not to be diverted about it. In the 2 minutes we've got, Paul, is there anything particularly highlighted in what you saw in the chat?
I mean, there's so much on here, Mel. I mean, the wonderful contributions that we've had from our 5 panelists have really sort of stirred up some interesting discussions. There's been some great points made about the role of the local authority and this whole idea of this sort of middle tier of governance and how the sort of the academization of the system and the role of maths in all of this, and how it's kind of made for quite a complex environment in which schools are not always entirely sure how to navigate. Again, I guess it's a kind of another example of how schools are, you know, doing well despite government policy, and I think there's something in that. Sally's discussion and certainly, sorry, Sally's points and certainly Joe's as well around this idea of autonomy, not necessarily creating the conditions for innovation, but actually getting people together to think together and work problems out together, is a much more powerful means of encouraging and sort of facilitating innovation, and something that, you know, Stephen Rayner picked up on here when he said notably a sort of a crisis that's clearly wrong-footed politicians and left them unable to interfere with the crisis management work of professional practitioners. And I think that's a really important summary there of what we've seen throughout all of this. And certainly a message that we've seen quite clearly through the 3 seminars as well, is that some of the really important and amazing work that's going on in our schools has been happening, you know, just despite policymakers' kind of interference. I mean, I could go on. It might be that we need to collect all these things in the chat, and we can perhaps share this more widely. But I know that we're up to 5 o'clock now, so I don't want to keep people any longer than we've said we would. But yeah, just to say thank you very, very much to everybody for your contributions in the chat. It's been really lively, and it's been going on sort of simultaneously while we've been listening to the panelists. Back to you, Mel.
Thank you, Paul. On the screen, I hope you can see the link that you need to get the various reports. You also find we produced a guide for the trios of schools, a very sort of light-handed thing to point to the sort of things that we have learned about this kind of collaborative process. And the 2 reports, and shortly we'll have a report from Paul and Stephen based on their kind of outsider, more formal research. And of course, we'll continue to add to that. And we're fortunate that we've got this fantastic website, the Greater Manchester Learning Partnership, which gets out into all of the schools and gives us quite a reach. So we're not going away. We're going to have another meeting of our strategy group very soon, and we'll be planning to bring something into the next phase as from September. And we want to keep links with anybody and everybody who's interested. So if you've got something else you want to say, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me and send an email. The only thing to say by way of conclusion, one of the kind of cliches in the school improvement world is it's often said school improvement is technically simple, but socially complex. And it came to mind that as we were hearing the 5 presentations, really, that the project we've designed is pretty simple. It's not very complicated at all. The complexity comes from finding ways of orchestrating it and making people aware of it and keeping people interested and motivated. That's what's fascinating about it all. So it's technically simple and socially complex. So thanks to everybody for joining in. Claire, do you want to say the final word?
Oh, no, just thank you. Thank you for attending all 3 seminars. They've been absolutely fascinating. I will send out all the materials tomorrow or in the coming days, and including the chat, because there are some fascinating insights in there. And please do sign up for our newsletter. I'll send you details of those as well. But thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.